Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive. I want to be entirely upfront with you right out of the gate here. Today's show is specifically curated for men who are actively looking for, incisive, unvarnished perspectives on the state of modern society.
Absolutely.
If you find yourself engaging with men's rights frameworks, or if you consider yourself plugged into the red-pilled manosphere, this is going to be an absolutely riveting conversation for you. And honestly, even if you just want to understand the architecture of these movements, you are in the right place.
Yeah, it's a massive cultural shift.
It really is. But before we get into the heavy lifting, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of these deep dives.
It really helps us keep bringing you these deep explorations into some, well, highly controversial and impactful texts.
Exactly. And speaking of the text, I'm going to urge you right now to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to grab today's featured ebook. It's called Thought Rape: How Feminism Weaponizes Emotionalism Against Men by Conrad Riker.
Published in 2025.
Right. And I have to tell you, it is an ultra-long, fascinating, and highly structured read. If you want the full, unfiltered experience of his ongoing work, you absolutely need to follow him on Substack at Conrad and Riker. Our mission today is to unpack Riker's incredibly detailed blueprint. We're going to look at how he traces the history of our core institutions.
How they were captured.
Exactly. How he argues they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, and most importantly, what he believes men need to do to survive in that environment today.
And before we start unpacking those claims, we really need to set the ground rules for how we are approaching this material today.
Yeah, that's crucial.
The book we are examining, Thought Rape, contains highly politically charged right-wing material. I mean, it directly and aggressively challenges mainstream institutional social narratives. So I want to make it completely clear to you, the listener, that neither of us here on the show is taking sides.
Right.
We aren't endorsing the book, and we aren't condemning it either.
No, we aren't here to be moral arbiters for you.
Precisely. Our sole job today, our only objective, is to impartially report on the original source material. We are essentially holding up a mirror to Riker's text. We want to convey his exact arguments, his data points, the historical connections he's drawing, so that you can thoroughly understand this specific worldview.
Because it's a major framework.
It is. We're acting as a neutral window into a framework that is currently driving massive conversations among millions of men.
Okay, let's unpack this. And we really have to start with the core premise, which is right there in the incredibly provocative title, Thought Rape.
Yeah, it's intense.
When I first read that, I thought, okay, that is a deliberately incendiary choice of words. But Riker isn't just using it for shock value, is he? He uses this term to describe what he views as a systemic form of psychological warfare waged against men.
He does. Riker defines thought rape as the systemic tactic used to silence men by equating their rational thoughts, their logic, and their everyday speech to actual physical violence.
Literally calling words violence.
Exactly. He argues that we've reached a societal tipping point where a man simply expressing an independent thought or stating a fact-based opinion that contradicts feminist orthodoxy isn't just debated anymore. It's treated as an act of literal aggression.
Wait, so he's basically saying that the feeling of being offended has replaced the fact of whether a statement is objectively true or false.
That is the foundation of his entire thesis. Feelings over facts. Riker argues that modern feminism has essentially hijacked public discourse by weaponizing emotionalism. And he doesn't just state this as a loose theory.
Right, he brings receipts.
He points to a 2020 study from the University of Pennsylvania to back it up. That study revealed that emotional appeals are 3 times more likely to go viral and gain cultural traction than rational, fact-based arguments.
3 times more likely. So it's basically an evolutionary advantage in the digital age to just be outraged.
That's exactly how Riker sees it. He argues this isn't just a quirk of social media algorithms prioritizing engagement, it's a weaponized reality. Feminism, according to his framework, has mastered this emotional hijacking. They've turned every cultural debate into a battlefield where subjective feelings are allowed to completely override objective facts.
And when feelings are the final authority,
logic is inherently ignored.
right.
And that leaves men stuck. They're unable to speak, unable to debate, and ultimately pushed out of the conversation entirely because their primary tool, rationality, has been completely invalidated.
And the book gives some really high-profile, undeniable examples of how this plays out through what Riker calls the feminist thought police and their primary weapon of choice, tone policing.
Tone policing is huge in this book.
I found this fascinating because he highlights cases where men were severely punished, their lives turned upside down, not because the facts they presented were proven wrong by other facts, but purely because their tone was deemed unacceptable.
James Damore is the quintessential example he uses for this.
Yes. Remember 2017? Damore is this software engineer at Google. The company is having an internal debate about diversity policies, so he sits down and writes a memo.
An internal memo.
Right. And if you actually read the memo, as Riker points out, it was incredibly calm, it was polite, it heavily referenced mainstream scientific research on the psychological and biological differences between men and women to explain why there might be a gender gap in tech.
He wasn't saying women couldn't code.
Not at all. He was talking about general population distributions regarding interests in things versus people.
And what was the reaction?
Complete corporate meltdown. He was fired. But Riker argues his real offense wasn't incompetence or harassment. His offense was simply having an independent perspective, expressing it openly, and doing so as a man. The facts of his memo were largely ignored by the corporate HR structure.
It was the emotional response to the fact.
Exactly. The claim that the memo made people feel unsafe dictated his punishment.
What's fascinating here is how Riker connects the Damore case to a broader pattern of institutional censorship. He doesn't view Damore in a vacuum. He links this directly to Professor Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College around that same time.
Oh yeah, the day of absence.
Weinstein opposed a day of absence event that essentially demanded white students and faculty physically leave the campus for a day.
Which, from a purely rational standpoint, violates the very civil rights principles institutions claim to uphold.
Precisely. Weinstein argued on principle that excluding people based on their race was fundamentally wrong, regardless of the historical context they were trying to invoke. And for defending basic equality and free speech, he was harassed by mobs of students, physically threatened, and ultimately forced to resign.
It's crazy.
And Riker weaves this together with Jordan Peterson's initial rise to prominence.
Right, over Bill C-16 in Canada.
Yes. Peterson opposed compelled speech laws regarding gender-neutral pronouns. He wasn't even arguing against the existence of trans people. His argument was a deeply rational, legal one about the danger of a government legally compelling its citizens to utter specific words.
But the nuance was completely lost.
Entirely stripped away. He was labeled a bigot and heavily smeared by the media. Riker views Damore, Weinstein, and Peterson not as random outliers, but as the initial casualties of a system that now strictly prioritizes ideological obedience over objective truth.
And this leads right into Riker's analysis of how society has literally begun to codify speech as violence. The book points out the absolute absurdity of this concept, and honestly, when you string the examples together like he does, the sheer scale of the hysteria is wild.
It really paints a picture.
Riker unpacks how cancel culture thrives on this false equivalency. He brings up the outrage over Halloween costumes at Yale University, where students claim that culturally insensitive costumes weren't just rude, but caused them actual physical trauma. They demanded administrative action because of outfits.
He also mentions the Dr. Seuss controversy, where decades-old children's books were pulled from publication for alleged racist imagery. The underlying claim wasn't just that the images were outdated, it was that the mere existence of these books actively harmed marginalized groups.
And then he brings it to the apex with J.K. Rowling. Here is a beloved author who simply tweeted that biological sex is a real, material thing, and the response: she received actual, literal death threats.
People trying to find her home address?
Yes. And the people hunting her down claimed that her tweets were a form of literal violence that endangered lives. Riker highlights the incredible dark irony here. The people claiming her polite words were violent were the ones actually hurling graphic death threats and celebrating the idea of her dying.
It is a stark contradiction, and Riker uses the psychological theory of symbolic violence to explain why this phenomenon is so effective.
Symbolic violence.
Yeah. He notes that modern critical theory and feminism argue that words can reinforce oppressive power structures, and therefore, words are indistinguishable from physical violence. But Riker argues that this is not a genuine philosophical stance. It is a highly manipulative strategic tactic designed solely to maintain ideological conformity.
Because if words are violence, you are justified in using actual violence or professional destruction to stop them.
Exactly. It acts as a loophole for aggression. If your speech is violence, then my firing you, canceling you, or threatening you is just self-defense.
Wow.
He views this as a deliberate tool to emasculate men. It conditions them from a young age to second-guess every single word, to hyper-self-monitor, and to shrink themselves down to fit into a tiny, constantly shifting box of acceptable behavior.
It creates an environment of total psychological safety for one specific group.
By enacting a massive, paralyzing, chilling effect on the other. Men are forced to walk on eggshells out of terror that their rational speech will be branded as a violent attack.
Which brings us perfectly to the psychology behind all of this. In Section 2, Riker delves deep into the victim mindset and a concept he heavily leans on: solipsism.
A very key concept in this space.
But before we get to solipsism, he anchors this in a widely recognized psychological concept called the external locus of control. Now, think about the last time you saw someone completely bomb a presentation at work, but instead of admitting they didn't prepare, they blamed the IT department, the lighting in the room, or the vibe of the client.
Right.
That is an external locus of control. The belief that your successes or failures are dictated by fate, luck, or systemic forces, rather than your own personal agency.
And Riker theorizes that modern feminism actively and deliberately encourages women to adopt this external locus of control. He argues it essentially teaches women from adolescence to blame everyone else, particularly men, and the abstract concept of the patriarchy for their own personal individual failures.
The anecdotes he provides to illustrate this are, they're wild, but they feel very familiar if you spend any time on social media.
They do?
Riker tells the story of a college student who completely failed her midterm exam. But instead of taking personal responsibility, looking in the mirror and saying, I partied too much and didn't read the syllabus, she blamed her professor.
But she didn't just say the test was hard.
No. She claimed the professor's microaggressions and his specific tone of voice in the classroom created an environment that was so oppressive, it actively prevented her from absorbing the material. She externalized her failure entirely onto a man's tone.
It removes all agency, which paradoxically is the opposite of empowerment. And Riker provides another example that is even more intimate. He cites a case of a woman blaming her personal weight gain entirely on patriarchal beauty standards causing her stress.
Unbelievable.
He even details an anecdote of a husband whose wife blamed him for her weight gain because his cooking was, and I quote, too delicious to resist.
So let me get this straight. He's literally being blamed and berated for being too good at making dinner. I guess burning the roast is now an act of feminist rebellion.
Apparently.
But it shows how deep this goes. Riker uses these stories to argue that feminism has created an entire cultural ecosystem where women feel completely justified in shifting the blame for their own daily choices onto systemic male oppression.
And that is where his argument about solipsism comes into play. Riker defines solipsism in this specific context as the profound inability of the female mind, when heavily influenced by feminist ideology, to separate her subjective internal emotions from objective external reality. In this framework, if she feels a certain way, that feeling is the objective truth.
Objective reality simply doesn't exist if it contradicts the emotion.
Correct. And Riker pairs this with what he coins the enemy illusion effect. This is a state where individuals create imaginary enemies or massively inflate minor conflicts, specifically to validate their own internal emotional turbulence, even when no real external conflict exists.
He gives a very relatable anecdote for a lot of guys here. It's the classic scenario. A girlfriend comes home after a brutal, stressful day at her office. She storms through the front door and immediately takes it out on her boyfriend.
Classic displacement.
Exactly. She snaps at him about the dishes, his posture, whatever. She acts as if he personally designed her corporate workload. In her mind, she expected him to magically read her mind, anticipate her exact emotional needs before she even walked in, and seamlessly fix her mood.
Right.
When he inevitably fails this impossible unspoken test, she accuses him of failing to perform his emotional labor.
This concept of emotional labor is something Riker critiques mercilessly. Originally, emotional labor referred to the psychological effort required by service workers, like flight attendants, to maintain a professional demeanor.
Yeah, Arlie Hochschild's work in the 80s.
Exactly. But Riker argues feminism has completely co-opted the term, turning it into a trap used to guilt men into doing more psychological heavy lifting in relationships, while simultaneously giving women a free pass to avoid accountability for their own emotional regulation.
It's a rigged game. And it exposes a massive societal double standard that Riker points out regarding how we view emotion itself. He observes that when women have intense emotional outbursts, crying, yelling, throwing things, using incredibly charged language, It is almost universally validated by society, by therapists, by the media as being passionate, authentic, or completely justified by her stress.
However, if a man raises his voice slightly, or even if he just speaks with firm, unwavering conviction without smiling, he is immediately labeled. He's aggressive, he's threatening, he's a prime example of toxic masculinity.
The tone police again.
Riker argues this double standard is the enforcement mechanism. It ensures that women's feelings are treated as sacrosanct and untouchable, while men's feelings, and even their calm, rational expressions, are deemed disposable or outright dangerous.
But that double standard doesn't just stay in domestic arguments or on Twitter. And this is where the book shifts gears into some truly terrifying territory for men. Riker shows how this exact emotional framework infects the legal and cultural systems.
This is chapter 3.
Right. Chapter 3 of Thought Rape introduces a concept he calls the retroactive consent paradox. Riker completely flips how we view modern dating. He introduces this terrifying idea that consent is no longer an action anchored in the present moment, but a hostage to someone's feelings in the future.
It is a radical shift in jurisprudence and social norms. Riker argues that modern feminist consent theory has created a framework heavily reliant on post-hoc rationalizations. This means that women are culturally empowered to withdraw their consent after the fact.
Let that sink in for a second.
A sexual encounter can be entirely consensual in the moment, enthusiastically so. But based on how the woman feels about it, days, weeks, or even years later, she can retroactively decide and publicly declare that it was non-consensual.
He argues this makes modern relationships an absolute minefield. You are basically gambling your entire life and freedom on how a partner might remember an event 5 years from now after a therapy session.
To illustrate the sheer cultural power of this shift, Riker points to the high-profile case of comedian Aziz Ansari.
Oh, the Babe.net article.
No.
That was a massive watershed moment.
It was. Ansari went on a date that ended in a sexual encounter at his apartment. By all objective accounts, and crucially, even by the explicit admission of the accuser herself in the article, the encounter was consensual in the room. There was no force, no coercion.
Right.
However, the next day, she felt awkward. She regretted the encounter. She felt he didn't read her nonverbal cues well enough. And the feminist media narrative immediately elevated this bad, awkward date into a national Me Too scandal, attempting to completely destroy Ansari's career and label him a predator.
They basically equated being a clumsy date with being Harvey Weinstein.
Exactly. Riker uses this to demonstrate exactly how post-hoc rationalizations work on a societal level. An individual reinterprets past events based on their current emotions, distorting the reality of the moment to fit a new victim-centric emotional narrative.
And the objective facts no longer matter.
The book argues that this constantly shifting goalpost of consent means men are presumed guilty based entirely on the subjective, retrospective feelings of their partners. The facts of the night are irrelevant.
And Riker scales this up to talk about the industrialization of this concept, what he calls the false allegation industry. He is fiercely, unapologetically critical of the Me Too movement, and specifically the cultural mantra to believe all women.
It's a foundational critique in the book.
He argues that this phrase, while sounding righteous and supportive on a bumper sticker, has completely upended centuries of foundational Enlightenment-era legal principles.
The presumption of innocence.
Exactly. By shifting the burden of proof entirely onto the accused, men are now treated as guilty until proven innocent. And the consequences aren't just a bad reputation. As the book outlines, the results are absolute financial, social, and psychological apocalypses for the accused men, even if they are eventually cleared.
Riker provides several harrowing, well-documented examples to ground this claim in reality. He discusses the infamous 2006 Duke lacrosse case.
Man, that kid.
You had a prosecutor, Mike Nifong, and a rabid national media that absolutely crucified 3 young men over false allegations of rape before a single fact was verified. The players' lives were dragged through the mud, their families harassed, their academic careers derailed.
It was a modern-day lynching.
It was. And it only stopped when irrefutable DNA evidence completely exonerated them. And even then, the apologies from the media were barely a whisper compared to the initial outrage.
And then he highlights the tragic case of Brian Banks. This one is just heartbreaking. Banks was a high school football prodigy. He had a full-ride scholarship to USC, a clear path to the NFL. His whole life was ahead of him. He was falsely accused of rape by a classmate.
Just a teenager.
Because of the pressure of the system and the fear of a massive sentence, he takes a plea deal. He loses his scholarship, his NFL dreams vanish, and he spends 5 brutal years in prison. And why? because years later, his accuser casually admitted on a hidden recording that she had completely made it up so she wouldn't get in trouble with her mom.
Over a lie.
5 years in a cage, stolen from a man over a lie.
Furthermore, Riker proves this isn't just an American phenomenon by bringing in the international perspective with the case of Liam Allen in the UK. Allen was a student who faced up to 10 years in prison for a false rape accusation. His life was in ruins.
And his trial only collapsed at the absolute last minute.
Right. When it was discovered that the institution meant to find the truth, had actively hidden thousands of text messages from the accuser that explicitly proved his innocence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker connects these massive legal failures directly to the everyday mechanics of cancel culture. He doesn't just say cancel culture is bad, he dissects it. He describes it as a literal modern-day witch hunt, operating on the exact same psychological hardware as Salem in 1692.
He breaks down the anatomy of this mob mentality into several key drivers: anonymity, tribalism, confirmation bias, and emotional contagion.
The architecture of the mob.
Right. Because of the internet's anonymity, people can viciously attack a man, try to get him fired, send death threats to his kids, without ever facing a shred of personal consequence.
Tribalism then divides people into rigid us versus them camps.
Where utterly destroying the enemy is the only goal, truth is entirely secondary. Confirmation bias ensures the mob only consumes the tiny, out-of-context pieces of information that confirm the man's guilt.
And then you have emotional contagion.
Which means the outrage spreads like a virus. It bypasses the rational brain entirely.
Riker uses the Covington Catholic kids as a prime example of this exact formula.
Nick Sandman.
Yes, a very short, highly edited video clip of a teenager smiling awkwardly while a man beat a drum in his face sparked global, hysterical outrage. Major media figures and celebrities were sending death threats against high school boys. They wanted their lives ruined.
Over a smile.
And all of this happened before the full 2-hour unedited video was ever released, which of course completely vindicated the boys and proved the initial narrative was entirely false. But the emotional contagion had already done its damage.
He also points to Justine Sacco, which shows how fast this happens. She made a poorly worded, arguably tasteless joke on Twitter right before boarding a long-haul flight to Africa. While she was in the air, disconnected from her career was destroyed and her life was ruined. The mob didn't care about her intent, they cared about the high of the witch hunt.
So, having established the symptoms, the false allegations, the emotional manipulation, the cancel culture, Riker naturally moves to the diagnosis. In Section 4, he asks, how did our institutions become the enforcement arm of this ideology?
He provides a historical perspective that is absolutely crucial to understanding his entire thesis. Riker traces the ideological roots of modern feminism directly back to Marxist class struggle theory.
Wait, he connects modern gender dynamics to Karl Marx. How does he map that out?
He argues that early foundational feminist theorists, specifically pointing to figures like Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan, essentially copy-pasted the Marxist framework of the oppressor and the oppressed. But instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they simply replaced the concept of economic class with gender.
Ah, so instead of the factory owners oppressing the workers, it's men oppressing women.
Exactly. In this adapted framework, men are cast in the permanent, irredeemable role of the ultimate systemic oppressors. And women are cast as the perpetually oppressed proletariat.
That's a binary view.
A disastrous binary view of the world, according to Riker. It ignores the incredible complexities of human relationships, biology, and history. More importantly, it deliberately reduces men to flat caricatures of evil in order to justify systemic institutional bias against them today. If men are historically guilty by default, then treating them unfairly now is just balancing the scales.
And according to Riker, nowhere is this systemic bias more brazenly evident than in the family court system. He doesn't mince words here. He bluntly labels family courts as a gynocratic institution. He argues that these courts are no longer about justice, and they certainly aren't about the best interests of the children. They are designed explicitly, from the ground up, for wealth redistribution from men to women.
He uses a composite but statistically representative story of a man named John to drive this home.
Right, John's story is brutal. John is a guy who works 60-hour weeks in a demanding corporate job to provide a great life for his family. He's the primary breadwinner. His wife worked part-time, maybe 10 hours a week, as a yoga instructor, mostly for personal fulfillment. After a decade, she decides she's unhappy and files for a no-fault divorce.
And John didn't cheat, didn't abuse anyone.
No, she just wanted out.
And what does the court do?
The court completely guts him. They strip John of half of everything he built. They force the sale of the home or give it to her. They give primary custody of his children to his ex-wife, reducing him to an every other weekend visitor in his kids' lives.
It's a total demolition of his life.
And on top of that, John is now legally forced by the threat of prison to pay $2,500 a month in alimony and child support to a woman who is already dating someone else, taking vacations, and living in the house he paid for. Riker points out a devastating statistic to back this anecdote up.
Which is?
Even when men spend tens of thousands of dollars to fight for custody, they win only 17 to 18% of the time. The system defaults to the mother. He views this as nothing less than a modern-day, state-sanctioned form of indentured servitude.
Building on this concept of systemic wealth redistribution, Riker unpacks what he calls the victimhood economy. He asks a vital question. Why does this ideology persist if it makes men and women so miserable?
Follow the money.
His answer is that there are massive global financial incentives driving the continuation of this exact narrative. The data he cites is staggering. Riker points out that the global gender studies industry across universities, publishing, and consulting is valued at over $1.2 billion.
Wow.
Furthermore, the annual budget for UN Women is also roughly $1.2 billion.
That is a colossal amount of money, completely dependent on the idea that women are oppressed.
Precisely. Riker refers to this vast network of universities, non-governmental organizations, and corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as the feminist industrial complex. His core argument is that these entities operate exactly like a massive corporation. For any business to survive, it needs a product and it needs consumer demand.
So in this case, the product is female victimhood.
Yes. And the necessary, unavoidable villain required to sustain the demand for that product is the oppressive, toxic male. Riker asserts that if true equality were ever actually achieved, or if women realized they were actually doing quite well, this multi-billion-dollar industry would instantly collapse.
All those professors, consultants, and UN directors would be out of a job.
Therefore, they have a massive existential financial imperative to perpetually frame men as oppressors. They must constantly invent new microaggressions and new invisible biases to justify their massive funding and their very existence.
And Riker shows how this victimhood economy doesn't just stay in academia. It bleeds right into the corporate world through the woke agenda and rigid diversity quotas. He argues that the concept of meritocracy, the idea that the best person gets the job regardless of immutable traits, has been completely sidelined in favor of ideological gender goals.
It's all about quotas now.
To prove this, the book cites an incredible 2021 study from the Harvard Business Review. In this study, an astounding 78% of hiring managers openly admitted to actively favoring female candidates over equally or even more qualified male candidates, specifically in order to meet company diversity goals.
78%. That is pure institutional capture.
It is the exact definition of systemic discrimination. Highly qualified men are spending years getting degrees, honing their skills, and they are being actively pushed aside, not because they lack talent, but simply because they are men. Riker notes that this doesn't just crush the individual men who lose out on jobs they earn.
It rots the companies from the inside out.
It leads to lower efficiency, declining profits, and toxic work environments because merit and competence have been forcefully replaced by ideological engineering.
This systemic marginalization in the workplace, combined with the extreme biases we just discussed in the family court system, leads directly to Riker's incredibly grim metaphor for modern relationships in Section 5. He calls it the marriage plantation.
The marriage plantation, that's a strong phrase.
Riker argues that marriage, which used to be a partnership of mutual benefit, has been transformed by feminism into a one-sided extractive contract where men are essentially treated as indentured servants.
It's a heavy metaphor, but he breaks down the mechanics of it. He argues that men are still rigidly bound by all the traditional conservative expectations of masculinity. They're expected to be the sole providers, to pay for the dates, to buy the diamond ring, to protect the family physically, and to sacrifice their own mental and physical well-being to keep the household running.
They do all the heavy lifting.
However, Riker contends that in the modern feminist framework, men receive absolutely none of the traditional benefits. They get no respect, no guaranteed loyalty, and no gratitude in return. Instead, they are met with constant demands for more emotional labor and the ever-present looming threat of a financially ruinous divorce if they fail to keep their partner perpetually happy.
And Riker grounds this bleak view of the marriage plantation in some incredibly stark, sobering statistics. He forces the reader to stop looking at the tiny percentage of male CEOs and look at the brutal reality of average male outcomes in society, contrasting it sharply with the relentless feminist narrative of male privilege.
The numbers are shocking.
The book points out that 80% of all suicides are men. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 out of every 5 people who decide they can no longer bear to live in this world are men.
Exactly. And on top of that, 93% of all workplace fatalities are men. Riker argues that society, driven by the feminist industrial complex, focuses obsessively on the minuscule fraction of men sitting in air-conditioned corporate boardrooms.
The 1% of the 1%.
Meanwhile, they completely callously ignore the millions of men who are doing the most grueling, dirty, dangerous, life-threatening jobs on the planet. Jobs like deep shaft coal mining, high-rise construction, deep-sea logging, and sanitation, just to provide for their families.
And society just looks past them.
He asks a very pointed, devastating question. How can a society look at these statistics, see men dying at work and taking their own lives at such astronomical rates compared to women, and still claim with a straight face that men are uniquely, systemically privileged?
It's a massive contradiction. And because of these grim realities, the legal risks of family court, the shifting goalposts of retroactive consent, the systemic discrimination in the workplace, and the complete lack of respect in modern relationships, Riker explains what he sees as the only rational mathematical response for men. He calls it the marriage strike.
Which aligns perfectly with the MGTOW movement, right?
Yeah.
Men going their own way.
Precisely. According to the book, men are looking at the chessboard. They see the rules of the game. They see that they are expected to risk 100% of their assets, their future income, and access to their unborn children for a contract that has a massive failure rate. So they're simply opting out.
They're walking away.
They are refusing to date seriously, refusing to cohabitate, and absolutely refusing to sign a marriage license.
Riker poses the ultimate question. Why would any rational, self-interested man play a game where the rules are constantly rigged against him by the referees? Why play when your house and your kids can be taken away on a whim through no-fault divorce, especially when 70% of all divorces are initiated by women? The marriage strike isn't a tantrum. It's men deciding, through cold, hard logic, that the juice is simply no longer worth the squeeze.
So we've gone through the institutional capture, the psychology of thought rape, the family courts, and the marriage strike. This brings us to Section 6, which is really the climax and the most actionable part of Riker's book, the Red Pill Awakening and Reclaiming Masculinity.
This is the survival guide portion of the text.
Now, the term taking the red pill, obviously popularized by The Matrix, is used heavily here. Riker uses it to describe the painful, often isolating, but absolutely necessary psychological awakening to the truth about how society actually treats men.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
He frames this awakening around the concept of cognitive dissonance. Riker says men experience massive, paralyzing cognitive dissonance when they look at their own lives compared to what the media tells them. Society constantly tells them they are privileged, powerful, toxic oppressors who have life on easy mode.
But their actual lived reality is waking up at 5 a.m., working 60-hour weeks in grueling jobs, walking on eggshells around HR tone policing, suppressing their emotions, and facing the terrifying biases of the family court system.
The narrative absolutely doesn't match the reality.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, breaking through that cognitive dissonance, shattering the illusion that society cares about your well-being, is the essence of the Red Pill Awakening.
It is the moment a man stops believing the societal narrative and starts fiercely trusting his own lived experience. Once that illusion is broken, Riker moves to reconstruct the male psyche by turning to evolutionary biology in Chapter 17.
I love this chapter because it gives men permission to be men again. He argues that the feminist pathologizing of masculinity is toxic. It's not only morally wrong, it is scientifically and biologically ignorant. Riker insists that men are biologically, evolutionarily wired over hundreds of thousands of years to protect, to provide, to build, and to lead.
It's hardwired.
He argues that the male brain is specifically hormonally adapted to handle high-pressure stress, to aggressively compartmentalize emotions when a crisis hits, and to solve complex, dangerous problems under fire.
He illustrates this with a compelling story about a CEO named John, different John from the divorce story. This John faced a massive corporate crisis. A supply chain failure that was hours away from destroying his multi-billion-dollar company and costing thousands of people their jobs.
And what did John do? He didn't call a circle to discuss his feelings. He didn't break down or externalize the blame. He relied on his deep-seated male instincts. He compartmentalized the massive stress, shut out the noise, made rapid, ruthless, pragmatic decisions, and saved the business.
He acted like a man.
Riker argues that this exact type of stoic, pressure-tested, unyielding leadership is literally what built human civilization. From aqueducts to skyscrapers to the moon landing, it required men suppressing fear to achieve a goal.
But modern society, driven by feminist ideology, looks at that exact trait, that stoicism and pragmatism, and demonizes it as toxic masculinity. Riker insists that when a society pathologizes male leadership, when it tries to drug or shame these natural biological drives out of boys, the entire society begins to stagnate and crumble. The world, fundamentally, needs men to lead, to build, and to protect. And Riker argues that apologizing for those evolutionary instincts is a fatal mistake for any civilization.
Building on that validation, Riker doesn't just leave men with theory. He provides a highly structured, incredibly practical four-pillar blueprint for empowerment, for men trying to survive and thrive in this hostile environment. The first pillar of his blueprint is documentation.
This is purely defensive, based on the reality of the false allegation industry we discussed earlier. Because men live in a world of retroactive consent and believe all women, Riker advises men to leave a meticulous paper trail for absolutely everything.
CYA. Cover your assets.
Record high-stakes meetings, save text messages for years, archive emails, use dash cams. In a culture where the burden of proof has shifted and men are presumed guilty, hard, objective, time-stamped documentation is a man's only reliable shield against the weaponization of subjective emotion.
The second pillar is financial independence and career diversification. This is about neutralizing cancel culture. Riker points out that the woke mob relies entirely on destroying a man's livelihood to starve him into submission and force an apology.
It's economic warfare.
If you rely 100% on one corporate HR department for your survival, you are completely vulnerable. Therefore, a red-pilled man must build financial armor, have multiple income streams, invest aggressively, build side hustles. If HR fires you because someone didn't like your tone in a meeting, your financial independence ensures they can't destroy your family or your life. Money is freedom, and financial leverage is the absolute best defense against institutional capture.
The third pillar is vital for mental health: brotherhood and male-only spaces. Riker points out that the feminist framework thrives on isolating men. It wants men to feel alone, to think they are crazy for seeing these double standards, and to suffer in silence. To combat this, men must intentionally build strong, impenetrable networks of like-minded men.
He cites the example of a men's fitness and networking group in Chicago. And he notes it wasn't just about lifting weights. It was about sharing legal strategies for divorce, offering business contacts, and most importantly, providing social proof that they weren't crazy.
It was a sanity check.
It was a support system that didn't judge them for being masculine, for wanting to win, or for speaking plainly. Riker says these male-only spaces where the tone police have no jurisdiction are absolutely crucial for maintaining sanity in a hostile culture.
And the final pillar brings it all together: mental and physical toughness. Riker tells men to hit the gym, and not just for vanity. He argues that physical strength fundamentally breeds mental resilience and confidence. You have to build the physical and emotional armor required to look the culture in the eye and refuse to apologize for being a man.
Don't give an inch.
When faced with emotional manipulation or thought rape, the blueprint explicitly instructs men: do not play their emotional game, do not validate the hysteria, stick relentlessly to the facts, use logic, and deploy humor and satire to mock the absurdity of these extreme ideologies. Disarm the attack by standing firm, unbothered, and unwavering in your truth.
So what does this all mean? We have just taken a massive, comprehensive journey through Conrad Riker's thought rape. This book provides a highly structured, incredibly unapologetic, and frankly aggressive battle plan for men navigating modern society. Whether you find Riker's arguments deeply validating of your own experiences, completely shocking, or intensely controversial, the architecture of his thesis is undeniable.
It's laid out very clearly.
From the weaponization of emotionalism to the massive economic drivers of the victimhood industry to the evolutionary defense of male leadership, he offers a profound, meticulously detailed window into a rapidly growing cultural movement that is reshaping how millions of men interact with the world.
It absolutely does. And understanding the granular details of this framework is essential for anyone trying to make sense of modern gender dynamics, the legal system, or corporate culture today.
Exactly. You've probably seen these debates play out in fragmented pieces on social media or felt the tension in a corporate meeting, but Reichel puts a structural label on all of it. And before we wrap up this deep dive, take a second to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss our future explorations into these kinds of paradigm-shifting texts.
We appreciate the support.
And I want to remind you, if you want the full blueprint, head over right now to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy the ebook of Thought Rape by Conrad Reicher. Read the full survival guide for yourself, and make sure you follow at Conrad R. Reicher at Substack for his ongoing unfiltered analysis.
As we wrap up this deep dive, remember that our goal today was simply to hold up a mirror to these arguments. We wanted to lay out the exact data, the historical perspectives, and the survival strategies presented by Reicher, offering you a clear, objective look at the Red Pill framework. But I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder on your own, extrapolating from Reicher's data on the marriage strike.
Late on us.
If Reicher is right, and this marriage strike continues to accelerate globally, if millions of capable, intelligent young men look at the rigged system and decide to completely withdraw their labor, their entrepreneurial leadership, their physical protection, and their financial contributions from societal institutions, what happens to the physical infrastructure and the economic stability of the world? Could the ultimate catastrophic consequence of pushing men to the absolute margins be the total collapse of the very society that engineered their exit?
That is a heavy, incredibly provocative thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.